They uninvited me from Christmas in a single blue bubble that blinked across my kitchen table, while the bank's little green check mark confirmed the money they'd be spending without me. This year, it's immediate family only. You always make drama, Linda wrote. I read it 3 times because sometimes words look different on the page. In my left hand, my phone chimed again. Monthly transfer completed, $4,200, to Linda's account. For the mortgage, for utilities, for the grandchildren's tuition, for their Christmas. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and orange peel, the one thing I insisted on every year, the peel ribbons that Robert liked tucked into the center of the Yule log. He would have rolled his eyes if he could see me now, trying to make sense of 2 facts that had landed on my lap at once, the exclusion notice and the proof that I had just funded the celebration I wasn't allowed to attend. I remember exactly when the money started. It was the sort of practical kindness you don't question when you love someone. Robert and I had been married 40 years by then. He loved a list and the certainty of a plan. When Linda and Marcus were house hunting, the market was a different animal. I signed a check for what felt then like a wild, bold thing, $180,000 toward their down payment. It was supposed to make a house possible for 2 kids starting out, not to buy myself a place at the table forever. I insisted we put an agreement on paper. Nothing dramatic, just numbers and timelines, because that was how Robert liked it. I still have that paper folded in the back of my top drawer. Over the years, the down payment became something else. The house appreciated the way houses do in a sunny market. The mortgage stayed stubbornly steady. I set up a monthly transfer to Linda, everything automated so I would not have to remember to log in every month. $4,200 seemed reasonable then, a portion of what we had always been saving, money I could spare without touching the accounts we used for travel or the garden. Part of me gave it because I wanted to help. Part of me wanted to keep the family close. That was the trap. Generosity and habit braided together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. When Robert died, there was this long, slow rearranging of the furniture of our lives. Grief changes the ordinary things. Whose turn it is to take out the garbage, which chair you sit in to read. I stopped traveling for a while. The automatic payments kept going. There was something soothing about that small constancy, the idea that some part of our plan for the family would continue. Linda would text now and then, a thank you, a picture of the kids. She would say how much it was helping. I told myself grief made my hands reach for steadiness, for holding on. Small things shifted first. Invitations changed into assumptions.
That parents-only sign at the school play, I didn't think twice when she said space was tight. We will only seat immediate family. At her holiday office party, they joked about a grown-ups night, and Marcus's smile had an edge to it when I tried to linger. Sophia, who used to hide notes in my coat pocket at Thanksgiving, started sitting closer to her mother at church, shushing me if I laughed too loud. Ryan became a teenager overnight, and I, who taught hundreds of middle schoolers once upon a time, suddenly didn't know how to reach him across that small modern gulf. When I brought it up, asking, why wasn't I invited, Linda turned the volume down with a phrase she used like a bandage. We're just trying to keep things simple, Mom. No drama. The phrase landed like a lid on a pot, and it worked. It stopped the conversation without addressing the question. Drama in their mouths felt casual, a shorthand for stop. In mine, it felt like being told my feelings were the problem instead of the exclusion. The more I tried to articulate my hurt, the more often those single words closed the door. It's not a big deal. You're making a scene. We're all stressed. You don't notice the slow accumulation of being pictured as a problem until there's a full stop, until an image appears that makes the whole trajectory visible. Mine was a warm gray iPad on the kitchen counter one evening when Sophia left it to charge after a sleepover. She'd meant to bring it upstairs for her homework and forgotten. I had no business going through it, but there it was, signed into the family group chat. You know that small, private glow of someone else's messages? Reading other people's private jokes is a particular kind of violation. Finding contempt there is worse, because it is a betrayal packaged as casualness. They weren't cruel in a way that calls for police. They were procedural, efficient, and relieved. The messages were a sequence of logistics and small boasting. Who would buy the tree that year, how much they'd spend on presents, who could rotate shifts with an aging aunt. And then a phrase, half a joke, half a declaration. No need to invite Grandma if she's just going to make everything about herself. Honestly, we get peace when she's not around. A string of laughing emojis. Someone else. She funds us, so it's fine, she'll pay. Another. It's better this way. Less drama, less guilt. I read them like a person unspooling. What stung wasn't just the cutting words. It was the bookkeeping of contempt. Their plan to enjoy the money I sent and to take the pleasure of the holiday out of my hands. The text from Linda landed on the table while the chat hummed in the back of my mind. Both arrived within minutes of my transfer clearing. The timing was a kind of proof that made anger plausible. It made being an invisible creditor feel like a reality. I sat there until the kitchen light went soft and the house yielded to its usual night sounds.
I felt foolish, then furious, then that peculiar humming grief that moves through you when the person you expected to grieve for is a relationship, not a death. This was the death of a thing I had always assumed about my family: mutual care and gratitude. My hands were shaking the way they never used to after a school assembly, though I had handled crises twice a week for 20 years as a principal. The next morning, Rose was at my door with 2 paper cups of coffee and a look I recognized from the first day my husband had been admitted to the hospital a decade earlier. Steady, not shocked, a person who has watched the fragile unspool but believes in gathering the strands back together. Rose has lived 2 houses down for as long as I can remember. Her husband painted my porch once. She taught me how to get the polenta right. She listened while I told her about the messages. She did not offer facile comfort. Instead, she said, "You need to know where you stand, not because you'll hurt them, but because you need to know what to do next for yourself." Next for myself sounded like a small island in the ocean. But words have gravity. They anchored me to a practical question. Who legally required me to keep sending $4,200 every month? I had never thought of it as a legal obligation. It had always been love and habit, and the reason you automate something so you don't have to decide again and again. Yet the automation had become a lever. I realized that if I wanted anything to change, I would have to examine the mechanics of the generosity. Rose drove me to a cup of coffee, and then to my desk, where the drawer holds the things after a long life. The stock of gift tags, a photo of Robert with his arm around me at our son's college graduation, and the folded piece of paper from that down payment. I dug it out and smoothed the creases. The writing was formal, the numbers unmistakable. $180,000 contributed by me toward the purchase. In the corner there was a scribbled note, equity share, from a meeting with a lawyer years ago. We had been pragmatic then. Some things in life you handle like you handle a project list. We ticked the boxes and moved on. There were other papers too, automatic transfer confirmations from the bank, a mortgage statement showing the balance, the homeowner's insurance receipts. On the corner of one page, someone in the bank's print had written a percentage, roughly 60% equity. The word equity had comforted me before. It meant the house had value, that the investment hadn't vanished. Now it looked like a complicated ledger between money and relationships. The down payment was my choice, a gift in one sense, but the paper trail had always meant there was a record, a way to show what I had done in case of need. I could see Robert folding that very sheet into his wallet. His confidence was in the paperwork. I called James Chen because Rose insisted.
He'd been recommended by a friend at the book club. He listens, my friend had said, and his office number was a small pebble I hadn't meant to pick up. The initial call was measured and simple. "Bring me what you have," he said. "We'll look at the documents. There are different kinds of obligations. Some are contractual, some are moral. Most monthly transfers are voluntary, but with the right paperwork, you may have options." He spoke without drama. He did not promise an outcome. He said this like someone who understands the strange way a law can both protect and complicate family life. When I hung up, I felt both lighter and more exposed. Light because there existed a person in the world whose job it was to read my papers and explain the parts that were confusing. Exposed because once the legal eye turns toward a family, certain things change in tone. You cannot be purely sentimental in those conversations. Numbers insist on being heard. Before I called the bank, I called my neighbor Rose again. She told me to make copies of everything and to hold on to the originals. She said not to storm into their house or confront Linda in anger. "You want eyes on it first," she said. "You'll make a better choice if you have facts and someone who can tell you what they mean." Going through the old emails and messages was a small archaeology of my life with them. There were pictures of Ryan's first loose tooth and Sophia's 6th birthday, receipts for school trips, even a note from Linda thanking us for hosting Thanksgiving one year. Interspersed among them were the notes that stopped conversations. "We need space. Mom, stop overreacting. It's not about the money." It was the way that phrase, "not about the money," functioned like a shield that hurt me the most, because to them it might genuinely have been about space or ease. To me, the money had been a way to stay close. I found myself rehearsing what I would say to James. "I want to stop being their ATM," I thought I would say. "I want dignity." But want is not a legal term. The attorney's office, I imagined, would reframe my language into options and warnings. I tried to brace myself for the practical things. What happens if I stop the transfers? Will tuition notices be late? Will their credit suffer? Could a sale be forced? Would stopping payments damage my relationship with the grandchildren beyond repair? These were real worries. They kept me up at night. On the day I called the bank, Susan Walsh answered with the kind of voice that belongs to someone used to being trusted with numbers. "We can look up your account, Miss Turner," she said. My name felt formal in her mouth. I liked it that way. I explained, careful not to enter territory that might be construed as something else, that I had an automated transfer set up and wanted to confirm the mechanics and what my options were if I decided to change or stop it. She asked for account numbers, dates, and clicked patiently as I read them out.
She explained in plain terms how an automated transfer works and what the bank's cancellation timeline would be if I chose to stop it. She did not give me a moral judgment. She told me the bank's mechanics, timelines, forms, the name of the department who handled guarantor removals. When I said aloud the figure, $4,200, it sounded both small and enormous, a monthly consequence of many small choices over many years. But words from the bank are not the same as a decision. They are mechanics. If I wanted to stop the transfer, Susan told me, there were steps. If I wanted to inquire about the equity in the house, that too required certain documents and often cooperation from the mortgage holder. Again, logistics, not judgment. Is that a common situation? I asked her, because somewhere in me I wanted the comfort of a shared human story. She hesitated. "We see family dynamics tied to finances all the time," she said finally. "They're rarely simple." Her answer felt generous because it admitted complexity. The bank could not make my family be different. I took this all home like a stack of opened envelopes and spread it on the table. The holiday napkins I had bought to set the table that Christmas, ever the optimist, I suppose, lay folded like a question at the edge of the pile. I called Marcus once, the way people call when they hope to find an explanation they can accept. He answered quickly, voice brisk. "Everything okay?" he asked. "I found some messages," I said, and I read them. "Mom," he said, "you shouldn't have been in there." "Shouldn't have been in where, Marcus? I was sent a direct message saying I wasn't wanted at the Christmas party." "Oh," he said. There was a pause, and in it I heard something like a recalibration. "Linda's stressed," he offered. "She's trying to keep the kids calm before finals, and—" "I get stress," I said. "I raised kids. I am not asking for drama. I am asking for a place at the table." He breathed out, a noise I knew well as the sound people make when they are about to choose between what is convenient and what is hard. "Look, Mom, can we talk tomorrow? I don't want this blown up tonight." "Why does the conversation get called blown up when I ask to be included?" I asked before I could stop myself. The words startled him. I think they startled me. The word drama had become a quarantine for feelings. Marcus cleared his throat. "Just wait, okay? Let's talk. We'll fix it." I believed him the way we tell ourselves comforting lies to keep from confronting the cold. When your instincts are to preserve a relationship, you give people chances to do better. But in the space between the phone call and the next day, my hands started doing what my heart couldn't, putting things in order. I made a copy of every paper. I wrote down dates of transfers. I noted which accounts I held and where. I took a photograph of the chat on the iPad because the written word in a private forum feels ephemeral until it is fixed in an image. I did not want to be the person who lost her voice for lack of evidence. That night, I stood in the hallway where our Christmas cards are tucked, and I looked at a photo of Robert and me from a decade earlier. He had his eyes crinkled at the edges, like he always did in pictures, smiling as if the world were arranged exactly as it should be. I thought of the Yule log and the orange peel that had always been folded in the middle because he liked the surprise. It felt absurd to be thinking of recipes and paper napkins when the quiet mechanics of nunny and exclusion were in play. Rose came over with a casserole because she said no one should be alone cooking on a night like that. We heated the casserole and ate silent portions, the kind of silence that has bones. She said nothing about lawyers or bank managers, only that she would be there if I needed to go through anything. "You don't have to handle this alone," she said. I wanted to say I had never been alone, that I had been surrounded by children and a house full of grandchildren, but the word alone stuck because it was true in a new way. They had each other. They had a life.
I had the money that kept their life cushioned and the clarity of being pushed out. The next morning, James Chen called to set a time. He asked me in the brief, even way that lawyers do, if I understood that there might be options and there might be consequences no one could predict. In this case, he said, we'll look at the agreement around the down payment, any guarantor language, and the setup of the recurring transfers. We'll need to talk to the bank. We can identify some possible steps, and I can outline risks and probabilities, but nothing is guaranteed. I liked that he used "in this case" instead of sweeping statements. It brought me back from a place of wanting definitive answers into the realm of careful work. On my way to the attorney's office, I drove past the house I had helped buy. It sat neat and decorated with lights, a ribbon on the wreath to the front door. The mailbox still had their family name on it. My stomach turned. The house had been their dream. I wanted to help make that dream possible because of love, and because Robert would have wanted it done cleanly. I had never intended for this to be the ledger of my exclusion. Stepping out of my car, I felt the familiar tilt of a woman who was about to make a practical decision. My life had taught me to gather facts before acting. As a principal, I had handled disputes and discipline. I had sat in the same chair I was heading to now, asking for accounts and notes, making decisions that balanced fairness and consequence. That training would be useful now. I knew this much. I did not want to be talked into returning to the old routine because it was easier.
I did not want a restoration that required me to quiet my own sense of dignity. I also did not want to wreck my grandchildren's lives out of spite. Those tensions were the marrow of every decision that felt moral in a family life. Walking up the steps to James Chen's office, I felt a brittle steadiness settle over me. I had done the work of gathering documents, of copying statements, of taking photos, of calling the people who could tell me what the paper meant. I sat in the waiting room and watched the receptionist screen for an appointment description. When my name was called, I rose, palms slightly cool, and followed a man who introduced himself as James. He had a quiet manner and a stack of paper already open on his desk. He did not smile in a way that made promises. He smiled the way someone who appreciated good paperwork does. "Tell me everything," he said, and for the first time since finding the chat, I felt heard in a way that was about more than calming words. I told him the sequence: the $18,000 down payment years ago, the automatic $4,200 monthly transfer, the messages I found, the immediate family-only text. I told him about Robert, and about the way grief had made me keep a steady hand on a calendar of payments. I told him I wanted two things at once that felt incompatible: to be treated with respect, and to avoid harming the grandchildren. He listened, and when I finished, he tapped a pen thoughtfully. "A lot of what you're describing is remarkably common," he said. "Families conflate generosity with obligation, and when a default in reciprocity occurs, there's often a legal component and an emotional component. My job is to help you see what the legal options might be, and what their likely consequences are in this case." "In this case," I repeated, because the phrase had become my anchor. "What are those options?" He did not launch into a list as if describing a menu. Instead, he explained that many recurring transfers are revocable if they are gifts and not guaranteed by contract. But there are other threads: the down payment document, any signed guarantor forms, and what the mortgage company reports about equity. If you are on the mortgage as a guarantor or cosigner, he said, that changes things. Equity may be argued about. There can be options like requesting a guarantor removal, but lenders don't always comply without a replacement or a refinancing. And there's always the possibility that stopping payments will cause financial stress on the family. He looked at me without flinching. There are also non-legal consequences. People get angry. They feel betrayed. That can affect relationships in ways no court can fix. "I understand," I said. The sound of my own voice steadied me. "I'm not looking to be cruel. I want to be respected. I want to know if my generosity has to continue simply because others are comfortable with it." He nodded. "We can look at the documents."
We can write a letter to the mortgage holder if appropriate. We can explore timeline options for stopping transfers. But, he paused, any path you take will have effects you may not completely control. I will, in this case, help you by laying out those effects and the probabilities as I see them based on the paperwork. It was not the absolute I had wanted. It was worse and better. It was real. I felt a wash of something like relief. Finally, someone was reframing this into facts and consequences rather than feeling. We scheduled a time to go through the paperwork in detail. He asked me to bring the original down payment agreement and any mortgage statements, and to forward copies of the messages I had found. Walking out of his office with a small manila envelope, I felt more equipped and yet more unsure. Equipped because I had a plan for discovery. Unsure because knowledge is a double-edged thing.
The more you know, the more you have to do with what you learn. I thought of the Christmas tree I had never put up in a hurry, the orange ribbons waiting to be tied. I thought of little hands unwrapping gifts, and of the quiet corner of the room where you sit and look at your own hands and try to determine whether you had done the kind thing or been taken. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. It was Linda. The text read, "Can we talk? I heard you met with an attorney." She added a string of anxious apologies after that, things that tried to soften the line between business and family. I parked and stared at the steering wheel. "We can talk," I typed, and paused. The pause was important because it kept me from writing the sort of message you send when you're trying to be everything at once: angry, forgiving, practical. Finally, I wrote, "Yes, we can talk. I have some questions I need answers to before I decide what comes next." She responded almost immediately with a smiling face emoji and, "Okay, Mom, we'll talk tonight." The smiling emoji felt like a small, brittle bandage. It did not address why she'd written the things she did, or the messages that said they were glad for peace without me. It deferred. Inside, something tightened. I had come this far because I wanted clarity that would allow me to choose with dignity. The next steps were not about being punitive. They were about refusing to be invisible behind a bank transfer. I sat in the dark of my living room and opened the manila envelope again. The folded paper of the down payment smelled faintly of old ink. For a moment, I thought of Robert with his list-making hand, and I felt both sad and resolute. I turned on the light and began to lay everything out on the dining table as if I were assembling a map. There are moments when you realize a habit has become a role that's been assigned to you without asking. The transfer had been mine to stop or continue, but I'd never considered stopping because stopping felt disloyal to the shape of the life Robert and I had planned.
Now that shape had been challenged by the small, sharp fact of being told I was always making drama. If generosity has an edge, it is when it is mistaken for default compliance. I found myself thinking about what I would say when we all next sat in a room together. Would I say, "You weren't kind"? Would I show them the messages? Would I stake the family on the paper trail? I pictured Linda's face, the one with the dimples she gets when she's trying to be sincere, and I pictured Marcus's jaw, the way he tightens when he thinks of inconvenience. I thought of Sophia and Ryan, and wondered how much of their holiday memory I wanted to hold. It felt petty to imagine them learning about money grief instead of learning what it feels like to be loved without condition, but it felt equally wrong to pretend nothing had happened. I made a decision then to wait until I had the facts in hand and the attorney's framework before making any public move. The difference between acting and reacting would be crucial, but the old automation of my life, that quiet monthly transfer, would no longer be an unconscious thing. It had become part of a conversation I did not expect to have at 50-something, with my hands white on the wheel of choices I had once thought were simple. That evening, I heeded the Yule log Robert taught me to make, although it tasted like a ritual I was going through, as much for the memory as for the flavor. I wrapped the orange peel tightly into the center before I set it on the plate. The day had held small practicalities: copies, calls, an appointment, a photograph of messages frozen in the glow of an iPad screen. It also held the old ache and a new small hope that I might reclaim the dignity that had been quietly siphoned away through automatic checks and quiet exclusions. I slept badly, thinking of mail that might arrive, of late notices, of tuition forms stamped with the words "overdue." I worried not because I wanted to punish, but because I wanted to prevent them from being taught that money and meaning are the same thing. The next morning, the house next door hummed with life. A dog barked, a child practiced scales. The smell of coffee rose like a promise. Then my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but I did. "Miss Turner?" a voice said, polite and brisk. "This is Susan Walsh in the bank's account services. Mr. Chen called earlier, and I wanted you to know we flagged your account for a review should you decide to make any changes to recurring transfers. You should bring ID and any authorization forms when you come in." "For what? To stop the transfer?" "We can discuss the process. That's all I can say on the phone," she replied. "If you're considering any changes, it's best to make an appointment." The phrase "flagged your account" startled me in a way the attorney's measured language had not. The bank had been notified, and bureaucracy had taken a small step. It meant the situation had entered a formality beyond my kitchen table. There was an inevitable slide now from private hurt into public procedure. I felt my pulse quicken, and the old list-making part of me took over. Appointments, forms, people to call, documents to bring.
I called Rosa to tell her I'd be at the bank the next day to speak with Susan Walsh about what could be changed. "Good," she said. "Bring the papers, make them show you where you stand." She didn't say fight or win. She said show you where you stand, as if the living had to be measured before one could act. That night, while putting away the Christmas napkins, I caught sight of the photo from our first Christmas in the house Robert and I bought together. He was wearing that ridiculous sweater with little snowmen on it. We were both young in it, or at least in the picture. He looks at me like we had everything figured out. I put the napkins away gently, the way you put a book back on a shelf you plan to reread. The next day, I would sit with a bank manager. I would sit with an attorney. I would bring every piece of paper I had and ask for clarity. And I would do it not to punish, but to gather my dignity back, one line at a time. The holiday lights outside my window twinkled, indifferent to the calendar of human feelings. The Christmas tree at Linda's house would be lit, and perhaps there would be a plate left for me at the end of the night. Or perhaps there would be silence. Either way, the automation that let me pay for their life without being part of it would no longer operate in the dark. I closed a drawer on the folded sheet with the $180,000 in it and left the Yule log on the counter. The next morning, documents ready in a neat stack, I walked to the bank and then to James Chen's office. My steps were steady now, because steadiness is not innocence, it is a practice. As I reached his office door, I realized that taking care of yourself sometimes looks like bending the world toward accountability, and that accountability, when mixed with money, will make people uncomfortable. The receptionist smiled, and I sat down, hands in my lap, waiting for the moment when I would say, plainly, what I had found and what it had meant to me. The door opened, and a man named James stood framed in the doorway, peering through familiar stacks of paper. He ushered me in with the same quiet that made uncomfortable words possible. He closed the door behind us, and I heard the soft click that divides the ordinary from the formal. He seated himself across from me, folded his hands, and said, "Let's go through what you have, step by step." He opened the folder, and we began, line by line. He asked me to read the down payment agreement aloud while he followed on his copy, and for the first time the paper didn't feel like a relic of good intentions. It felt like a map.
"Here," James said, tapping the paragraph with his pen. "You called this a contribution and noted an equity share. That language matters. It suggests more than a gift, though it doesn't automatically make it a contract enforceable in the way a mortgage would be. It gives us leverage to explain what you've already done. In this case, a lender might view the equity differently, but it's useful evidence. In this case, the phrase sat with me like a small, solid stone. It kept the conversation honest, which is to say, undramatic. He didn't promise a neat courtroom victory or a fairy tale reconciliation. He gave me options and their likely fallout. He explained that many recurring transfers, when not tied to a formal obligation, were revocable. That is, I could stop them, but that the down payment document could be used to argue for repayment if things went that route. He said lenders don't like surprises, and that their first move in the event of missed mortgage payments would be to call the borrower, not me. "So," he said, folding his hands, "if you stop the transfers, what can we expect in the short term? Their credit could suffer, bills could go unpaid, and the lender may begin collection activity if the mortgage falls behind. There's also the human thing. Linda and Marcus may react angrily. In this case, some families reconcile after a hard talk, others don't. I will not sugarcoat the strain this could place on relationships. There was a logic to this. Stop the money, test the dependency, let consequences teach a lesson. But I was not a woman of theory. I was a woman who had sat at the kitchen table and watched a tiny green checkmark clear, while a text told me I was not welcome. I wanted my dignity back, but I also did not want to be a villain in the story of my grandchildren. The choices folded into each other like paper cranes. They were delicate, and in the wrong hands they could tear. We began with small, controlled measures. James helped me draft a letter that did 3 things. Explained I would be pausing the recurring transfer while we reviewed the financial arrangement, requested documentation about the mortgage and guarantor status so we could explore a formal guarantor removal, and offered a meeting to discuss an orderly transition should everyone agree to restructuring. It was a firm letter, not a threat. The language was precise because precision prevents misinterpretation. In this case, James said,
We write clearly so there's no ambiguity about intent. You're not surprising anyone. You're asking for clarity." I remember leaving his office with the letter in my hand and the odd sensation of being both ordinary and intentional. Ordinary because so many people have to navigate family money. Intentional because I had finally decided that the work of generosity could not be one-sided. When I handed the letter to Susan at the bank, she folded her own copy into the computer and gave me a patient look.
"We can place a temporary stop on the recurring transfer if you want," she said. "There are forms, signatures, and there will be a hold period. In this case, if the payee disputes it, or if a court order appears, there may be complications, but those are rare." She used the word rare the way meteorologists use unlikely. The bank put a temporary flag on the transfer and scheduled an appointment for me to sign the cancellation forms in person, which I did the next day. When the transfer didn't go through that month, it felt like the kitchen light had been dimmed a notch and the house was breathing a little differently. I watched the pending payments page with the same kind of attention I had once given to the school roll call. I did not feel triumphant. I felt careful. The small proof that something had changed arrived in the form of an email from my bank. "Your scheduled transfer did not process this month." It read like a neutral clerical note. It felt momentous. The calls came fast. First Linda, near hysterical in the way children can be when they think they have broken a toy and know it can be fixed if they run fast enough to the store. "Mom, please," she said. I could hear Sophie murmuring in the background. "We had a gap with the tuition authorization. There's a fee. Can you—" "How can I be asked to cover a fee if I'm not coming to the Christmas table?" I said. "I'm sorry," she said. "We didn't mean—" "Did you mean to exclude me while using the money?" I asked, and the line went quiet. I heard her breathe. "I don't want the grandchildren to miss anything, Linda. I want them to have the trips and the tutors and the cello lessons they enjoy. But I won't be the bank behind the curtain while being told I'm only drama. You can call that whatever you like. I'm calling it dignity." There was a pause, and then she started to cry. "We're in a bind," she said. "Marcus said he would handle it. He thought—" I don't know what he thought. The "we're" made the problem bigger. I could tell this wasn't just a sob. It was the sound of someone colliding with the real consequences of months of convenience. Phone calls from Marcus came next and were less tender. He tried the old scripts. "You don't have to stop. We can refinance. You must understand." His voice hardened when I did not give him the soft landing of immediate capitulation. "You're trying to punish us," he said at one point. "I'm trying to stop being used," I replied. The phrase landed quiet and true. He accused me of putting my pride above the children. I could imagine him pacing the house, feeling squeezed between a mortgage and the idea of humiliation. I felt for him in small ways. I also felt firm. The first tuition notice arrived 2 weeks after I stopped the transfer. It came in a crisp white envelope, stamped with an amount and the word overdue. There were discrete fees for late payment. A voice call followed from the school administrator, measured and apologetic. "We want to work with you," she said, and I felt the vulnerability in her voice. Schools are not interested in family debts. They are interested in education. I paid the tuition out of my checking account that time, not because I had been blackmailed, but because I could not bear to let the children miss lessons for which they had practiced. Do not mistake that for weakness. I made that choice because I could and because it mattered to their learning. But I also told Linda plainly that I had paid this one time and that continuing to subsidize their lifestyle while being excluded was not acceptable. That set off a pattern where I helped with immediate child-centered needs when it felt necessary, but I did not resume the monthly transfer that funded mortgages, utilities, and lifestyle padding. I made a distinction between supporting children's needs and subsidizing an adult household as its default financier. I told them I would help in emergencies, but I wanted transparent accounting, a conversation about priorities and obligations, rather than being quietly assumed into a provider role. The reaction was what James had warned me about. At first, there was panic that had practical edges. The mortgage autopay was scheduled for 3 days later, and without my contribution, the family would have to cover the full amount. The bank sent the borrower a notice asking for clarification about how the remaining payment would be made. I watched the space between them and the lender tighten like a shoelace. Marcus sent a text that tried for conciliatory tones. "We can figure this out, Mom. Just, can we talk? Don't make any big moves." He used the word big as if my move were an explosion rather than a necessary halt. Linda begged. There was pleading that pulled at me in a place I did not entirely trust. "Please, Mom, don't make us homeless," she wrote in all caps in one message that made my chest constrict. I called James that afternoon and read him the message. He listened and then said carefully, "There is a difference between being a safety net and being an ongoing guarantor.
You have been clear about what you can and cannot sustain. In this case, one strategy is what you are already doing. Pause the recurring transfer and offer short-term child-centered help while negotiating long-term arrangements. That forces the adults in the house to either adjust or seek alternatives, like refinancing or taking on additional work. I can't tell you which will appear. I can tell you what is likely. Some strain, perhaps a sale if the mortgage falls behind enough. Would they actually sell? I whispered, because it felt like a terrible cruelty to sentence the grandchildren to upheaval as punishment for their parents' choices. In this case, a sale is possible if arrears accumulate and the borrower can't remedy them, he said. But often lenders and borrowers scramble to avoid that outcome because foreclosure is a last resort.
People will cut expenses, find loans, or even move in with parents. The outcomes vary. It was the uncertainty that hurt. I had never wanted a forced sale. I had wanted a conversation, one that acknowledged my contribution and my feelings. But the conversation had been closed with a word, drama, clenched enough to show he had not slept. He and I stood across from each other like two people negotiating the terms of a ceasefire, rather than relatives rebuilding trust. Look, he said, opting for honesty instead of the usual defensive scripts. We messed up. We didn't know how to set boundaries without making you feel... You made a boundary, I said. It was a boundary that excluded me. Boundaries need reciprocity. When you told me to be less dramatic, you were using a word to avoid answering a question about inclusion. He looked down. I shouldn't have said that, he admitted. It's just been hard with work. The house... I know it's hard, I said. I know the mortgage is a burden. I also know that kindness doesn't have to mean being unacknowledged. You could have told me you needed help paying the mortgage without pretending I was the problem. He swallowed. We can refinance, he said. We can talk to the lender. Refinancing takes time and often hinges on credit, I said. And right now the mortgage company needs to see payments. I can help with a short-term bridge for the specific items that affect the children, but I won't resume the full automatic transfer as the status quo. You're making rules, he said, sounding both hurt and affronted. The word rules made him sound like a child again. He thought I was being rigid. Maybe I was, but what I was trying to build was a framework that respected me too. Days became a rhythm of calls and notices. The mortgage didn't immediately fall behind. They coordinated, scraped, and shifted resources, but the margin was thin. There were late fees for utilities, a warning call from the lender about a possible shortfall, a voicemail time-stamped one early morning asking how they'd manage next month. I watched all of this with a complicated tenderness. I felt bad that my action had ripple effects, and I felt stronger for not being silent anymore. Throughout this period, I kept journals. They're a small thing, a red-bound notebook where I wrote line items of emotion and then crossed them with practicalities, dates of transfer, notes from meetings, names of bank officers I had spoken to. Recording things made them manageable. Writing them down turned the kind of raw hurt that could feed shame into a practical ledger I could use to act. It was a habit Robert and I had shared. Write, plan, do.
It took about 3 months before the real confrontations began to change their tone. There was a night when Linda came over and sat on my sofa and cried in a way that had nothing of theatrics and everything of fatigue. We didn't plan this, she said, and I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. Marcus was embarrassed. We forgot how to ask. We thought your money would always be there, I supplied gently, because I think sometimes the worst truth is the one you can't say to their faces. She flinched but nodded. Yes, she whispered. We were comfortable. We didn't realize what we were doing to you. That night, we spoke like adults who had been abruptly given an accounting of their life choices. Marcus joined the conversation later, and we did something that strangers and families rarely do. We wrote a simple plan. It wasn't dramatic. It was a spreadsheet of obligations, who would pay what, and a commitment to family meetings every month. They proposed to seek refinancing. They agreed to track discretionary expenses more carefully. I agreed to reconsider a smaller contribution, contingent on documented steps toward financial responsibility. It wasn't reconciliation like in a movie. It was a series of small, bureaucratic acts. Sign this, call that, and a human act that matters almost as much. They apologized without hedging. We were wrong, Marcus said. We used a word to shut down your complaint. We're sorry. I accepted the apology and told them I wanted more than words. I wanted to be present in spirit and sometimes in person, not an automated check. But not all consequences were patched with a meeting and a spreadsheet.
There were moments when the strain revealed deeper fractures. A couple of months after the pause, the lender called the borrower and issued a formal warning that began the process that could, if arrears mounted, lead to foreclosure. James's cautionary words echoed in my ears. Lenders don't like surprises, and they will act to protect their interest. In the end, the family scrambled to refinance. They found a co-signer within their circle whose credit could support a better rate, and they sold off some unneeded assets. The sale we had quietly feared happened, but it wasn't the house I'd helped buy being repossessed. Rather, they sold a second property they'd been keeping for occasional guests. It was, in a way, a recalibration. Less square footage, less overhead, more breathing room. The grandchildren adapted with the natural grace of children. Sophia's cello lessons continued because we prioritized them. Ryan spent a season at a different tutoring program that cost less but was still helpful. There were losses and adjustments, yes, but also dignity restored in ways both small and substantial. They learned, perhaps earlier than they might have otherwise, that resources are finite and that adults face consequences for the choices they make.
As the family's financial picture adjusted, my life opened in ways I did not entirely expect. The first month after the transfer pause, I felt light, as if a weight I'd carried unknowingly had lifted. I had planned trips Robert and I had talked about. He had liked the idea of seeing shorelines we hadn't yet visited, and there had been lists and maps tucked into his old planner. I had always put those plans on hold, deeming family obligations paramount. Now, with pockets of time reappearing, I booked a short trip to the coast for a weekend of quiet, and then, with a courage I had not expected to summon, I bought a cheap plane ticket to a small town in Maine we had once noted in the margins of a travel magazine. I hesitated before telling Linda about the trips. There is always a taboo in families about celebration during hard times. But I did tell her, I'm taking a short trip. It's something Robert wanted. She texted a smiling face and then, tell me everything when you get back. That was permission, of a sort. Travel was a balm in ways more practical than picturesque. I found a rhythm of mornings spent walking on cold sand and afternoons lost in bookshops and small cafes where I scribbled notes. I rejoined the book club I'd left when Robert's illness first began. There was Rose, waiting with a cup in hand and a smile that meant we were both present now, not as caretakers but as chosen companions. I also returned to the community literacy program I had volunteered with years prior. They needed someone to run an adult reading circle at the library for people who'd never had the chance to graduate to comfortable reading. I taught for a season, then for another. Sitting with adults as they sound the out words and finally connected sentences into stories felt like touching the pulse of something holy and ordinary. I was giving away time rather than money, and it felt like a trade that cost me nothing and returned everything: purpose, laughter, and the delicious exhaustion of useful work. The money I had once sent in automatic transfers, I redirected in deliberate ways. I set up a small scholarship fund in Robert's and my name at the community college for single parents seeking evening classes. I worked with a local literacy nonprofit to sponsor a reading corner at a nearby elementary school. When I made these decisions, I did not announce them to the world like a hero laying down riches. I told Rose, and then the librarian, and then the attorney, because some of these changes required paperwork, and some required a sanity check. James smiled when I told him. In this case, he said, you are redirecting resources in ways that align with your values. That's perfectly reasonable. I updated my will with James's help, not because I was expecting anything dramatic to happen next week, but because that is the kind of practical thing Robert and I always did together.
I chose to allocate some of that money to long-term things that reflected our shared commitments: literacy grants, a small endowment to the local arts center, and a discretionary fund for grandchildren that required them to participate in service projects to access it. It was my way of saying, I love them, but I love them in ways that encourage responsibility and generosity of spirit, rather than dependency. People asked me if I regretted what I had done, and I always thought about how to answer that with both honesty and humility. I do sometimes ache for the uncomplicated holidays we once had, the smell of citrus peels in the Yule log, the easy presence of grandchildren piled in the kitchen while we laughed at old jokes. There is real grief for what was lost in a more innocent season. But regret would mean I had somehow wished to remain the invisible benefactor who could be dismissed. I don't regret reclaiming myself. There were moments of awkwardness at family gatherings. A few times Linda and I stood in the same room and felt a wall of cool politeness between us. Other times we sat for coffee and exchanged recipes. She would tell me about Sophia's latest cello recital,
and I would tell her about the adult reading circle. Time and ordinary interactions did what formality and letters could not. They let us practice being family anew. One Christmas, a year after the hiatus of the automatic transfer, Linda invited me to their holiday dinner. I thought of the blue bubble again, the text that had uninvited me, and I had to decide on my terms whether to go. I sat with that decision and asked myself the question Robert and I had often turned to in smaller fights over the years. Will this choice tend toward peace or toward resentment? I went, but not because I was desperate to be included. I went because I wanted to be present if they offered me genuine inclusion. They had, by then, apologized without hedging and had taken steps toward financial readjustment that respected us all. I brought the Yule log and the orange peel tucked in the center, because some rituals are anchors. At the table, no one made any grand proclamations. We ate with real conversation that was messy but honest, no drama put out like a banishing spell. There were small smiles shared across plates. Sophia snuck a napkin into my pocket just as she used to, and I felt a softening in my chest. I did not mean to gloat, and I did not. Instead, I felt the peculiar satisfaction of someone who had chosen herself without trying to punish anyone else. Over the following years, my life settled into a new architecture. Travel punctuated my seasons, volunteer commitments kept my days full in a way that mattered, and my financial affairs were quieter and more deliberate. The automatic transfers remained paused. Linda and Marcus managed their household with more transparency. The grandchildren learned that grandparents are people too, with boundaries and choices.
People sometimes asked whether I had been cruel or whether I had been right. Those are moral questions people enjoy answering in the abstract. I think the truest measure is the aftermath. Did the family learn? Did the grandchildren go hungry for the holidays? Did dignity return to my days? The answers were complicated. The family learned some hard lessons about money and reciprocity. The children continued their lessons and their life. I found new friendships that were chosen, not defaulted into by blood alone. I felt respected in ways I hadn't in years. I never liked the notion of payback. I liked the notion of consequence. There's a difference. Payback is vindictive. Consequence is the honest fallout of choices. When people are sheltered from the consequences of their choices, they often repeat harmful patterns. Sometimes removing a cushion is the kindest way to teach accountability. That was what had happened in my house. The pause I put in place forced an honest accounting. There were awkward moments, to be sure. Thanksgiving, when conversation dipped into silence. A birthday present returned with a note that tried to explain the distance. There was a season when we were strangers, navigating a map we'd never given each other. But over time, the edges softened. We rebuilt aspects of relationship in new ways. Some habits returned, others did not. That is the shape of mature families. Some things are elastic, some break, and never quite meant. We learned to accept that. As for me, the hardest and yet most satisfying change was internal. For decades, I had equated generosity with sacrifice. Not every generous act must be sacrificial to be meaningful. You can be generous and set limits. You can give time, money, and affection, while also insisting upon reciprocity and respect. There is a dignity to that balance. I practiced it, and like any muscle, it strengthened. I do not tell this as a template for everyone who reads it. The law in other places might function differently, and the human calculus will always vary. James was careful to remind me of that. If you are listening and wondering what you should do, remember this. One woman's story is not a universal prescription. Talk to professionals. Consider the children. Know that legal options and moral choices don't always line up perfectly. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. But there is a rightness in refusing to be someone's habit when you're really a person. People sometimes ask what I would have done differently. I think I'd have spoken sooner about how I felt. Not in accusatory ways, but in two-way conversations that invited responsibility. I'd have watched the automatic transfer more closely, not because money is evil to give, but because stewardship includes awareness. I'd have taught the grandchildren earlier about sharing resources and service. But those are gentle regrets, not regrets that make me want to undo the boundary I set.
Years after the blue bubble and the cleared transfer, I sat in a small hall at the community center where the adult reading circle met. A woman who had struggled with reading for years turned a page and then looked up at the group, her eyes shining, and said, "I never thought about stories before." The room clapped, and I felt a heat in my chest, like a small, warm ember. That afternoon, I thought of Robert and the orange peel, and the way things we do quietly can ripple for years. I thought of dignity reclaimed, and of children who grow up watching adults who both help and hold accountable. Sometimes, on a winter night when the lights are out,
I will take the folded paper from my top drawer. It still smells faintly of old ink. I unfold it and run my finger along the line that says $180,000. I think of the house it helped buy, and of how that paper carried more stories than numbers. I think of the green check mark that once cleared with no fanfare, and of the text that uninvited me. I think of all of it with gratitude and with a new kind of firmness. If this story has touched you in some way, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Tell me if you've ever had to turn money into a boundary. We are less alone than we think when we share these awkward, tender parts of being human. I don't pretend to have found some holy grail of justice. What I did find was an honesty that suited my life at 50-something, the willingness to stop funding a relationship that diminished me, and the courage to redirect my resources towards things that felt generative and true. The family learned hard lessons. Some relationships deepened, others took different shapes. Both outcomes were honest, and in the end, that's what I wanted. Here is the last quiet piece. Both sides, in a way, ended up with what they had chosen. The family chose a kind of peace that required less emotional labor from them. I chose a peace that required less financial invisibility and more deliberate giving. Neither path was painless, but both were real. There is a justice in that. If you want to hear more stories like this, honest, messy, and practical, subscribe to the channel. If this resonated, share it with someone who needs to hear that boundaries are not betrayals, but a form of self-respecting love. Thank you for listening to mine.